A very warm welcome to you here at Staple Inn and around the world for tonight's discussion. We're going to hear from two working parties within the health and care practice area. The intention is to showcase some of the member-led research that is being performed within health and care. I'm hoping you'll find it informative, and perhaps it might just inspire some of you to volunteer for future working parties. So later this evening, we'll hear from the Antibiotic Resistance Working Party, who will give an overview of some of the modelling work they've been undertaking. But before that, we have the Wearable Technology and Internet of Things Working Party. Hopefully, some of you have had the opportunity to download the excellent Sessional paper. If you've not, then I'd encourage you to take a look at this. On a personal level, I find this a fascinating topic, especially in the era of continuous underwriting and consumer engagement. I recall several years ago speaking to a taxi driver, and when he found out I was working in the insurance industry, he waxed lyrical about how life insurance was a complete rip-off. As he said, he'd spoken to lots of his friends, and none of them had ever received anything from it. I kind of refrained from pointing out that this was probably good news, but the perception of not getting anything from the policy, coupled with the lack of engagement, was really overriding. Hopefully tonight we'll hear some thoughts about how engagement can be improved. So the Working Party will present its findings after 2 years of investigation, exploring the current and future world of insurance in the face of rapidly evolving technology. With a rapidly evolving and sometimes bewildering technology market, the presented paper does not have all of the answers and will no doubt raise further questions. But it should open the minds of attendees to the risks, considerations, and challenges that the technology poses for our industry. So representing the Working Party this evening, we have two members of the Working Party. To my immediate right, we have Anna Spender, Director of Actuarial and Data Analytics at Cyan. Anna heads up Cyan Insights, providing data analytics, actuarial, and well-being consultancy services to companies, insurers, and advisors. She's a qualified actuary with over 20 years of experience in the life and health insurance markets. She has held senior roles in pricing, experience analysis, and proposition developments in some of the major UK insurers and reinsurers, covering both the UK and overseas markets. If we move 2 places to Anna's right, we have Colin Bullen from Habits at Work. Since 2013, he has been the head of Habits at Work, a niche Chicago-based consultancy that helps organizations deliver performance-enhancing habit change using context design. Colin qualified as an actuary in 1992 and has specialized in health and well-being since 1998. Prior to joining Habits at Work, Colin was the global head of health and well-being at A&E Hewitt. And at this point, I'd like to welcome Colin.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Hey, there we are. If we can't make it to the football, let's enjoy this. This is the feedback session on 2 years of work that the Working Party on the Wearables and Internet of Things has achieved. We're pretty much going to follow, for those of you who've actually downloaded and looked at the paper already, the format of the paper, so we're going to follow that stream. In terms of what the Working Party was set up to achieve, obviously focusing on wearables and the Internet of Things, but specifically focusing on health and care. We have looked occasionally in other insurance industries that we think might inform the health and care arena, but generally that is the focus in terms of our audience. And specifically, we're not just looking at currently available technology and evaluating what's already out there, but doing a little bit of crystal ball gazing to determine whether there is known or expected technologies which may or may not be interesting to us in the future. The working party was divided up into 2 work streams, one headed up by Anna and one headed up by myself. The reason I'm presenting first is I was looking at, with my work stream, looking at devices and their uses, and it makes sense for that kind of scene setting at the beginning. Anna's work stream then looked into stakeholders, their interests, and that follows on nicely from that introduction. I'd like to thank everybody that was involved in the working party. Particularly, I'd just like to call out our 2 experts, Oliver from the technology point of view and Kotha from the clinical point of view, provided very useful guidance and direction as we developed the report that you may see on the website. So, this, as Chris highlighted in the introduction, is a rapidly changing space. To the extent that when we started the working party, we did the research on the devices and got to a good understanding of what's currently going on, only to find that when we wrote the report, 18 months later, things had already moved so much that we had to really go back and do that exercise again. The speed with which technology is coming to market and changing the capabilities and opportunities for us as an industry is quite bewildering, and it will continue at this pace for some time, we think. In the light of that, it may surprise some of you, particularly involved in the health and care space, to see that 30% of insurers are already making some use of wearable technology at this point in time. Now, bear in mind that includes the general insurance community, who are perhaps a little bit further ahead in this space than we are from a health and care point of view. But it also means that it could be quite a small part of the services that are being offered that are actually making use of this technology in practice. But one thing is for certain, that number will grow, and will grow very rapidly indeed. In terms of the devices we've looked at, I don't know if you can see that from the back of the room, or indeed online, but we found that there were a very significant number of devices. We're not going to go through each one, don't panic, but it gives you an idea of the kind of range of devices you need to think about in terms of what might be beneficial to us. And they're covered in 5 categories. The ones we tend to think of are the ones that we classically put on our wrist. Most of us will have at least know what a Garmin or a Fitbit or something like that does in terms of its ability to track steps and so on. Most of us will have used or worn one. But there are devices that are built into clothing. There are devices which are worn on the body in other areas other than the wrist. There is the whole subject of the Internet of Things, where data is gathered from various places and used and digested and reformatted for us to make use. And then there is, from the medical device specific, devices that are designed to address one particular disease or concern for an individual, very precise, built for that purpose, perhaps not easy to wear or use for a long period of time like perhaps the others, but much more accurate in terms of what they're delivering in terms of results. I'll come back to that accuracy piece a little bit later in my piece. I would like to highlight a few, and I'm going to pick on 5 from the section under body, devices worn elsewhere on the body, and just pick on 1 from the Internet of Things. The first device on that list is something called the Oura Ring. It's a device that, as the name suggests, it is a ring, but what it does is very similar to what's available from devices that are worn on the wrist, but even more. So, for instance, it can take body temperature. It's a device that's designed principally to assist with sleep and understanding sleep, and many of these devices that are emerging are following that particular track. But it's, for us, perhaps the most advanced and most accurate of the devices that are currently available that either are worn on the wrist or somewhere near the hand. Neuroon is a very interesting device. It's a mask. Fits across the eyes, again, focusing on sleep. what this device does, and the reason I've highlighted it, is it measures EEG waves. So the alpha, beta, delta, and theta waves that are generated by the brain. Why does it monitor those? To get an accurate indication of where the individual is from a sleep stage perspective. The mood metric, this is the first of what I expect to be quite a large number of devices that monitor, as the name suggests, mood, our emotional state. Now, this particular device, and indeed the software that supports it that goes onto the phone, evaluates to the extent that stress is draining you or building you up during the course of a day, how are you using your emotional resources. And obviously, if you are draining them on a regular basis, you're going to run out at some point in time. So useful for tracking emotional strain of people, but the first of a number of devices that can start to track how we're feeling as opposed to just monitoring steps or something physical. Freestyle Libre, this is a patch that goes on the arm, which then monitors blood sugar levels. It does so on a continuous basis. Very useful for diabetics in terms of understanding, not just in the old format of a pinprick or of the blood draw, knowing where you are at one point in time, but the device allows you to see continuously how your body is digesting the glucose, at what speed, what the peaks and troughs look like in your blood sugar profile. Much more useful information to understand from a diabetic, indeed from anybody's point of view, who's borderline. And then finally, the Omron is I suppose it is a wrist-borne device in the sense that it does fit on the wrist, but it's around measurement of blood pressure. Again, doing so on a relatively continuous basis, inflates and deflates during the course of the day. So instead of, again, just getting an instantaneous measure of where your blood pressure is, you get a measurements over the course of a day, giving a much more accurate profile of how you're responding to circumstances and situations that you are facing up to, and of course from those who are hypertensive, knowing when it peaks. The final one on the list in the Internet of Things is Sentience. Sentience actually presented here last year as part of an update program from us. And the reason I've highlighted them again is it's a very important style of measurement which we call frictionless. The way Sentience gathers data is that because you take your phone with you wherever you go, it's got a whole host of sensors built into that phone, and it tracks what you're doing. It knows where you are, it knows what speed you're going, it knows how you're changing direction, and it uses that information, or Sentience, you download all that information and are able through that to evaluate characteristics about the person that is using that phone. So it'll know if you're a dog walker, if you're a restaurant goer. It knows how you're driving your vehicle, and the general insurance community is already latched on to this. But the important point is you don't need to do anything for the data to arrive and be used. And that element of choice is quite important. One of the challenges we're always going to have is where you execute choices to whether you're wearing the wristband or other wearable device. You can, to some extent, influence the way data that's going through. So if you know what the data is being used for, your ability to select or control that data is there. When you're using frictionless tracking, that disappears into the background and becomes less of an issue. You're not choosing when it's on or when it's off, it's just tracking what you're doing. How does the data arrive? It arrives through a series of sensors that I was just alluding to. A lot of them are geared around measurement of emotion and so on. You've got fairly advanced EEG and ECG measures, sensors coming to the market, being tracked into miniature form and being able to be fitted into smaller, comfortable wearable devices. There are also sensors on here we just really haven't got a clue how to use yet, or even make use of the data, so something like oximetry, skin temperature. You know, it's data, it might be interesting, we don't know. Others have perhaps got a little bit more direct use. And then from a measurements perspective, those sensors generate data. The data is then passed through algorithms to determine measurements. And some are more direct than others, and this is another important theme that we need to pick out from what we're saying. Some measures are processed, indirect, and others are more direct in the way in which it's, for instance, in relation to heart rate. The heart rate sensor will evaluate your heart rate, it will record it, and that's the data that you get back. So I just want to pick out a few to highlight. Blood sugar I've already talked about in the sense that you have a patch that's allowing you to evaluate blood sugar on a continuous basis and therefore get a much more accurate statement around how you're actually processing glucose in the body. Fitness is a real interesting one for me, for us, for our business, in the sense that the research that we've done suggests that fitness is one of the key indicators for your prospective health and longevity for the future. And yet until this point, the only way to get fitness really measured is to go onto a treadmill with a horrible device attached to your face and have your breathing monitored and so on to get that cardiovascular fitness, the VO2 max. But now the algorithms are starting to pick up, particularly ECG data, and come up with some fairly respectable measures of what your fitness is. And this, again, could be very useful in the evaluation of future risk. The galvanic skin response is the mood metric. This is it's actually the same technology that's used in lie detector tests. So it's monitoring how stressed you are at any point in time and measuring skin conductance and using that to evaluate emotional state. I do think this will be a very important part. We're picking up more and more in relation to mental health rather than just the physical health. And that kind of ability to measure, I think, is going to be particularly important. Then finally, on the right-hand side, sleep quality rather than sleep quantity. There's a tendency to just focus, and rightly so, it's very important, on how much sleep we get. But the stages of sleep are also critical. So knowing when you're in deep sleep or N3 sleep, knowing when you're in REM sleep, which is important for memories and cognitive function, executive function. Again, it's not something we know too much about yet, but the studies that are being published at the moment that have picked up on this particular issue on the back of the ability to monitor sleep quality are showing that this is going to be important information for us going forwards to evaluate risk. So one of the key questions that we had to ask on behalf of the insurance community is just how accurate is the data? And a secondary question is how consistent, how regular are the results that come out? And if you put these devices into laboratory conditions, you actually find that, generally speaking, they're not too bad. So, for instance, steps, we're seeing a plus minus 10% variation in the results that are recorded in laboratory situations. Heart rate I alluded to earlier, it's a pretty direct measure. Steps, incidentally, is an indirect measure. It's you've got a variety of accelerometer and other motion devices which algorithms are then interpreting to determine how many steps you've taken. But they are coming out reasonably accurate, sufficient to say that it's good enough for our purposes. However, some of the devices also report back on energy consumed, how much energy the body's consuming, and therefore that's meant to guide you on how much food you take in. But it's rubbish. The quality of the data is just not worth the paper or the screen that it's written on, and it should not be relied upon at all, even in laboratory conditions. There are many considerations around why there are variances. It's around the design of the human body, it's around how the devices are worn, the fact that some of the data that is included relies on self-reported information. So, for instance, distance travelled is quite a common one to report on, but that's a derivation of you putting in your height, from which stride length is estimated, and then combined with steps to give you an answer of distance travelled. You can see how things get a little bit stretched in terms of being reliable as a result. There's this important point about what's direct and what's indirect. So if you're going to make use of any of this data, we strongly recommend that you understand whether it's being directly picked up by a sensor and reported literally, or through very limited algorithms, or whether there's a lot of processing in order to get the measure that you're looking at. Unfortunately, we don't all live in laboratory. Well, very fortunately, we don't live in laboratory conditions. The real world gets in the way. People don't wear devices. People are all shapes, sizes, do various things with their devices. Even when people who've run the tests have put the two devices next to each other on their wrist and have done exactly the same thing during the course of the day, there are still significant variances in the results that come out, to the extent that the results we've seen suggest that it could be plus minus 100% variance. And that's on something reasonably reliable like steps. So something to be aware of is that the accuracy of the absolute values, treat with a pinch of salt at the moment, it will improve, and they are driven to get more accurate. But the counter to that is, from a consistency point of view, it seems that whatever the errors are that are occurring for an individual occur consistently. So that when you look at the consistency of the results that are measured over a period of time, they're much more stable and more reflective of the changes that the individual experiences. And therefore, if you're looking at change rather than absolutes, you're in a pretty good space. In terms of the current uses, the traditional areas that we're more familiar with, health biometrics, outcomes to some extent, behaviours. But again, Chris alluded to this in the introduction. The devices and the measures that are created allow us to get to know our clients a lot better and offer an opportunity for us to engage customers in new ways. However you choose to use that data, use it wisely, and you could get a better interaction. There is also the tendency to think about these devices as drivers of health. If we wear a device, then we get healthier. That's not strictly true. There is an association between the two, but you have to look at the context in which those devices are being used. It's not the device usually that's creating the change. It's either the software that's communicating to the individual about the measurements that are coming through. Quite often they'll be delivered as part of some broader program, and it's that program that creates the change for the individual. It's supported by the device, which provides data feedback to the individual, enables motivation where you're driven by goals in order to get there, but it's not the sole driver of change. It offers us the opportunity to look at disease-specific products, and we've already started to see those come to market of various providers, and they mentioned in our report are picking up on diabetes as an issue. That ability to continuously monitor blood sugar is changing the game for diabetes risk. If you can demonstrate to an insurer that you can manage your condition and do so consistently, you can actually start insuring that condition in a way that wouldn't have been possible before. And then the whole methodology around management of chronic conditions. If you have a chronic condition and you get better quality feedback in terms of understanding how you are managing that condition, then you should be able to control it. You're more likely to be able to control it. So let's just run through those relatively quickly. From an engagement perspective, we think they present an important new opportunity for the communication that we as an insurance industry have with our clients. It's something we've been historically very poor at, and there's a great opportunity here to engage in a much more effective way. Disease-specific products are, as I say, already there, and there will be more. From an underwriting perspective, there's both the initial opportunity, more data at the point of initial underwriting of the acquisition of the client, maybe even the use of a device to gather a little bit more information during the application process. Or there's the continuous underwriting, which is starting to emerge as a new opportunity for us to evaluate how an individual behaves, track their performance during the course of a year, and at the end of that year, you can then adjust either premiums or benefits in order to reflect what they've actually done in terms of your contractual commitments to each other. Reward determination, reward science is a whole subject on its own. It's a whole evening on its own. But to the extent that you might choose to use rewards in whatever shape or form they exist, the more accurate evaluation of what the individual is due by way of a reward is there. And then there's the accumulation of behaviour and biometric data. We may not know what to do with that data at this point in time, but that's not the point. The point is that there is clear evidence of a relationship between behaviour and outcomes, and those biometrics as a way marker to those outcomes, and starting to gather the data and link it to the wealth of information you've got around claims and experience will start to feed into the creation of better products using this technology. From a well-being perspective, the more traditional space, the ability to track behavior and biometrics and use that to create performance feedback for the individual and coach them into a better way of behaving based on goals that they'll be setting. That's probably what you think of when you think of the devices for the most part. As I said, we also looked at general insurance just to understand how far ahead they were and to see if there are any lessons learned. And I'm just going to highlight a few of the uses that they're currently making at the moment, and you can draw your own conclusions. The tracking of vehicles to evaluate risk in terms of how people drive. Claims risk management, they're using devices in environments to evaluate the relative flood or fire risk that buildings or places are exposed to. Cover as and when you need it. So again, looking at vehicles, just using a vehicle and being insured for the period of the time that you use it. There's no need to own a car anymore, but you still need to be insured. Obviously a problem from a health and care perspective in the sense there's too great a risk for anti-selection, but you get the point that the technology allows you to do this. From a claims processing point of view, the use of technology, video technology, photographic technology that allows you to share information about a loss situation that helps loss adjusters and claims analysts determine what the loss incurred has been. And then the very dangerous subject of social media. I mean, hot on the heels of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, it's going to be a dangerous place to go for a while, but you can be very sure that the information that exists in the social media area is going to be used, and the general insurance community is already starting to do that. Finally, just to wrap up on the other uses side, just a little bit more tangential, the opportunities for home diagnosis to sit and have a virtual GP conversation, and you've got the diagnostic tools available to you. Mental health, there are some brilliant VR, virtual reality simulators, which help people with mental health conditions deal with those conditions, train themselves in relatively safe environments to have a real life but not quite real life experience. Medical monitoring, again, coming back to the efficiency of our GP and physician community, their ability to do more with less face-to-face interaction. And then finally, from a sports coaching, a lot of the technology we're using is coming from sports. There's a lot of money flowing into sports, and their ability to drive performance of the users through the monitoring technology is stuff that will feed out and dribble out into our community in due course. So that's it from me. I will now hand over to Anna, who will pick up for the second part.
Okay, hi everybody. So once we'd looked at the current landscape, so the devices, the measures, and how it's currently being used, we went on to debate actually what insurers who are engaging in this area need to consider. So I'm going to cover some elements of data considerations, risks and challenges. I'm also going to look at future developments in technology, because there's some things that where we previously may have thought of them as science fiction, they're either here or they're not too far away. And then finally going to look at what does this all mean or potentially mean for insurance. So, obviously, one of the big advantages of using insurance, using technology in insurance, is the amount of data and the types of different data that potentially we'll be able to collect, and the insight and differentiation that can drive. Colin's touched on a few things, though, that will give us challenges in that area. At the moment, there's not a set model. There's not studies out there that are really evidence-based, at least in the public domain, that we can look at to say, this is definitely the data that's going to be significant going forward. So as you're building propositions and you're investing money into systems to collect this data, are you collecting the right data, and how is that going to evolve over time? So the other area to think about is in terms of actually the cost and the benefit of that data going forward. And that cost may be increased, because at the moment we don't know what's going to be significant. Definitely a lot of the measures Colin's covered will give us a good indication of health in an individual, but is that what you're going to be using going forward? And I'll come on in a little while into why that journey might evolve. But the cost of those systems at this point in time may be more, because you will have to build in flexibility. You'll have to be able to adapt those models going forward as we learn more. It would be remiss of me not to mention GDPR. I'm sure everybody in the room has heard it a lot recently, but obviously that came into force on May the 25th. In the world of GDPR, firms will only be able to collect data that's relevant, adequate, and not excessive. So going back to my previous point on what do you collect, that's going to give you some challenges. Definitely, we've got to think of this data in a new way. It's got to be secure, and it's got to be treated with respect, and we've got to earn the trust of those users. So insurers are definitely going to have to invest in resource and time to make sure they're not just compliant, but they've got an eye to the future in this area. Especially because this data is going to be related to health, it's going to be sensitive data related to behaviours and lifestyles. Obviously, we need the right consents in place for that data, but maybe another challenge is, are people going to give you their data? And why should they? Arguably, as Chris mentioned, in the life insurance scenario, and people saying they're not actually getting anything out of the life insurance, the model will change, and some of the advantages to using technology means that it can become a much more engaging proposition, not just at set points in time. But we're going to have to build engaging propositions that people want to engage in, are willing to give us their data because of what they're going to get in return. And we need to do that on a foundation of trust, so that's going to be very key. There's going to be IT constraints for insurers in terms of this type of dynamic new data, the volume of this data. Old legacy systems will not be able to cope, and new systems will need to be agile to change. And also actuarial constraints, not just actuarial, but data analytics constraints. Well, there's no models sitting out there, there's no tables sitting out there, and it's going to be very different from what we've got at the moment. So if you engage in this now, you're going to have to do it with limited evidence out there and build your models in that way. So another thing to consider when you're looking at how you use that data is the potential for fraud. We've heard many stories about the different usage of devices that have been registered to people, but they've used kind of devious means to try and get their activity up, such as giving them to a child, giving them to a fit friend, or a lot of animals actually, tying them to the horse, the dog. In one case I heard of a chicken who, unfortunately, with said device, met quite an awful demise one evening. So there's that to consider. And regardless of what's going on or if it's going on, insurers are going to need to have models and algorithms that can spot potential fraudulent behaviour, but also manage it. Colin touched on frictionless tracking, and obviously the way you look at that data will also have to depend on how that data is being collected. So if there's a selective element to someone actually using a device, choosing when and where they wear that device for their own purposes, that's going to be very different from frictionless tracking where the data is coming in consistently. And is it fit for purpose? So some of the smartphones have a lot of measures on them, but they're a secondary purpose to that device and may not be as accurate. There's also the potential for systematic errors in terms of the device itself, but you also need to consider actually, if you're looking at one individual using one device over the time of the contract, it's probably not a problem. But if that individual upgrades to a different device or totally changes device mid-term, how do you measure the impact of that, and especially where incentive programs are concerned? So also Colin's touched on this, but it depends where the device is worn, how the device is worn, that also impacts on those results and the accuracy of those measures. In a laboratory, they may be really accurate, but in the hands of users, they're potentially not so. And then also, how do we look at the data? So changes over time versus a point in time will be very different in terms of how we consider the level of accuracy and the consistency of data we need. Looking at cohorts arguably will reduce the variability in that data, but if you're looking at an individual life, either in terms of a risk assessment or in terms of an incentive program, then that may be different. So they're all the kind of things that we need to start thinking about. The other thing to think about is in terms of data collection, data analytics. Do you invest in your own or do you partner with an external company? There's aggregators out there now which basically pull together multi different data sources. They collate them, they clean them, they format them and give them back to you in a usable form. They're fairly new. Obviously, they're growing with the devices that are out there, but they're typically agnostic, so any device can be used with it, which should be more engaging to individuals. So risks and challenges. When we looked at risks and challenges and potential viable insurance products, we looked at 4 different areas. So the tech capabilities that are out there and changing, the insurer's objectives, the regulator's objectives, and also the customer objectives. And we looked at debating these areas in quite some detail. Some of it I've already covered, but again, if you notice there, I've probably got pace of change a couple of times. It is really significant because this market for technology is changing all the time. Not just in terms of what we can measure, but how we can measure it and how we can engage customers. So obviously there's a big element around the data quality, the processing, the reliability of that data, and it's going to take time for us to build up meaningful data sets and the right data sets. So business cases that go in now may look for something different. Maybe it's more engagement than actually we're going to improve health in some way, but they should evolve over time. The pace of change should be considered as well when you think of your internal processes. So if you're going through a long proposition development cycle, it may be that by the time you get to the end of your cycle and launch your product, the technology's moved on at a pace again. So that's something to consider. Cost versus benefit, we talked about earlier. The change in role of the insurer was an interesting one. So as technology advances, this gets more accurate and we're able to be more accurate in our risk assessment. Does that actually undermine the whole traditional model of insurance in terms of pooling of the risk? And also what impact does that have on potential customers, especially higher risk customers? There's also the ability that customers may start self-diagnosing and then selectively choosing where they go and how they do that. And one contentious area that we had a lot of discussion on was around the role of the insurer in actually, if you're setting an incentive program or you're looking at particular diseases and you're putting things in place that say, these are good behaviours and this is what we'll reward you for, are we blurring the line between insurance and medical advice? And what could that look like? And will the wording in our policies save us from any anything coming back on us in that area? Data privacy we've talked about, but we've got to really make sure that that's secure, especially building up that trust element. And again, in terms of regulation, the pace of change. Will regulation keep up with the pace of change of this technology and how we're using it? Arguably not, given GDPR has just come in to cover a lot of data that's already been out there for some time. So insurers will have to make their own view of what that might look like going forward and how it will impact their products. In terms of the customer, we all know as individuals that it's unlikely that a customer is going to get given a device and suddenly think, right, I'm going to go and exercise now. It's not the solution, it's an enabler to the solution. So it's not on its own going to change behaviours. Unfortunately, just changing to good health practices is not enough for a lot of people, and incentive programs seem to pick up in this area in terms of getting people to address that. But it's getting that sustained, consistent usage, which the device alone would not do, and the effectiveness of that behavioural change, which again is a subject within itself. But as I said before, these products are going to have to be engaging. They're going to have to be based on a foundation of trust, and the security and also clarity of how we're going to use that data is key. So going forward, what does the future look like, or what potentially does it look like now? So I've just listed a few different things that we've come across, just to give you a feel for what might be out there. So tracking emotional states, there's various ways this can be done. This is already happening, but it's not mainstream, but we can see how it can move to mainstream. For example, there are companies out there who have embedded this type of technology in their staff passes. So the staff pass might have a GPS sensor, as well as voice analysis that can assess your stress levels and also your coping mechanisms. And also Bluetooth functionality that can look at your body language. If you combine that with all of your employee data, you can start being a little bit big brother in understanding who's talking to who and when distress levels spike. This is an interesting one, microchipping for humans. Obviously, we've microchipped pets for a long time now, but this is an area that's evolving fast. There's a Swedish technology hub out there who have already offered these kind of implants to their employees, which just is embedded under the skin, and it allows those employees to open doors in the building, print, and also pay for drinks. And there's some events that this type of technology has been used as well to access. But it's evolving very quickly, and it won't be long, we think less than 10 years, before it also monitors things like health. Colin mentioned as well wearables in sports. It's certainly an area that a lot of this technology is developed in terms of elite athlete performance, but it can be used in all kinds of aspects of the sports industry, and they're usually at the forefront of using this. So it might be to give a tactical advantage, it might be in terms of coaching, it might be in terms of predicting injuries, rehabilitation, or improving the customer expectation of that sport. So there's a lot out there. However, there was a case last year where the Boston Red Sox were accused of cheating for using this type of technology and relaying information via Apple devices during the match to players. What else is out there? So brain-computer interface. Facebook have announced that they are looking at this in a lot of detail, and their plans are to go beyond tracking emotional states to actually reading people's minds. They haven't said how they're doing this, obviously, and that information is not out there, but this is coming, and it's already being used in some other areas. Exoskeletons, one that you can clearly see a use for, especially in rehabilitation around spinal injuries. So there's whole bionic suits that actually interact with the brain as well. But there's also something called the chairless chair that allows industries such as manufacturing for their employees to sit wherever they need to sit at any point in time. So what does this all mean, or what could this potentially all mean? We don't have all the answers for the future of insurance. So we don't think insurers are going to drive the take-up of technology, but more and more we will become users of it, and also the data that comes out of that. We do think this element around anti-selection and asymmetries is an important one. So as these devices get more accurate and the ability of individuals to diagnose at home becomes much more of a reality, people will start choosing what insurance they want and when. And then it will depend on who's on this journey already in terms of insurers and who's left behind. There's definitely a lot of new opportunities, so there's lots of ways that we can start to engage customers in a much more informed way. New products, whether that be disease-specific products that can be managed, or just totally different ways of looking at insurance and the journey that customer has with us. And the multi-touch points as well. And then beyond reported conditions and claims, so that is really looking at what else can this sort of technology begin to tell us in terms of people's health and the predictions in terms of people's health. And then, of course, what we've covered already, the collation of that data and the analysis will be a challenge that we will need to overcome. Evolution versus revolution. We believe to date it has been pretty much an evolution. It is expanding rapidly. People are getting on board, as Colin mentioned, but it is very much a journey. And there there is a risk element to getting on board at the moment, but there's also a risk element to not getting on board at the moment. But you've got to kind of take that leap of faith and design your product maybe in a way that evolves over time. You're not going to have all the answers now. Living up to the hype, I don't know if people are aware of the Gartner hype curve in terms of technology, but we really believe that we're getting to the top of the hype. There's been a lot of buzz around wearables, hasn't actually lived up to its hype at the moment, but it will be coming down to actually a productive level of how they're going to be used going forward. Another area to consider is who will take advantage. So if we don't, as insurers, take advantage, will tech-savvy companies come into the market, totally reinventing it? Short-term versus long-term is what I was saying about the sort of business case changing over time. So you might actually design a proposition now to start you on the journey, collect that data, engage with customers, and then actually how you use that long-term in terms of behavioural change and looking at how it can affect health will come at a later stage. And will there be game-changing innovations going forward? I've got no doubt there probably will. So there could be automatic monitoring of what people are eating, for example, and we know that technology will continue to change. So the only question really for everyone is, when will you get involved and how? So in conclusion, we've said it many times, too many times, it's a rapidly developing area. You know, as soon as we'd finished writing the paper, we could probably go and research today and there'll be more things out there. There's definitely a market opportunity for us, but it also could be a catalyst for change in terms of how we engage with our customers and how we're seen by our customers. It's only part of the solution, so you need a bigger proposition around it to really engage the customers and keep them on that journey. Just giving them the technology themselves, it's not going to change anything. Data considerations we've mentioned, which is obviously really key, and also with the ability to look at what regulation may come in the future, but that we're always looking at that data with an ethical and moral behaviour. There's a risk the market fragments through the change in the underlying looking at risk in a very different way and being able to assess risks in a different way, and the reduction of the pooling system. Definitely think we're going to see more specialist products come into the fore for dealing with specific diseases. And as I've said, it's an evolving business case and product development journey for people. Okay, that's it.
Thanks very much, Anna and Colin. So at this point, I'd like to open the discussion to the floor. As a reminder, if you wish to contribute, then please wait for the microphone to be brought to you. And could you start by saying your name into the microphone? Any questions or comments? At the front here.
Thank you. My name is David Simmons. I'd like to first of all thank the speakers for a very interesting talk. Two comments really. One in the mood/emotional space. And my comment is about being very clear about what data we are collecting. For example, we might be collecting pitch of voice or some electronic measure, which we're then deriving or interpreting as some emotion or mood. So I think we need to be very clear about that. The other observation from the general insurance industry is how you get people to use this stuff. Now, in the case of young drivers, for example, most insurers pretty well insist that they have some tracking device fitted to their car. So for that particular group, they've almost forced them to actually do it. So they literally forced them to engage. And one theory is, if there's any thoughts on this, is what difference does that have? Is there a timing thing? So you have a device fitted to your car. Maybe for a few months, you drive a bit more carefully. After a while, you forget it's there. And then does the claim experience then go back to what it was if you didn't have that device in the first place? Thank you.
Any comments?
I think just to quickly respond on the data side, I think that the point could be made generally. You picked up on one particular area, but the important part of this journey is that we're going to be accessing more and more data that we're not used to holding, and interpreting that data, using it in the right way for the right reasons, and generating trust with our clients in the way in which we handle that. We're going to have to go beyond the legislation, and if we're going to have any kind of relationship with our clients, we're going to have to build it and be very aware of those nuances in the way the data is collected. So yeah, I just want to pick up on that.
Mohammed Hashimi. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's good to see the impact on life and health. But one of the things I was thinking, this might impact on other fields where actuaries work as well, like in pensions. People live longer, healthier, and they live longer. So I was just wondering if you would consider looking into the impact of wearable technology, given that it's not only the tech companies, it's even the government considering actually using wearable technology to improve the health of the general population.
We definitely focused on the life and health area, so we didn't pick up on pensions at all. And I don't think we picked up on pensions when we looked out and beyond that area. Definitely a consideration. I guess there's also the aspect that we discussed in terms of who will interact with this technology, what populations will interact with it easily, share their data easily, and who won't. And obviously, I guess the pensions, it's going to depend what time in that life cycle of the pension that you look at that. I don't know if you...
Any further comments or questions?
Hi there, Matt Kirkpatrick, Government Actuaries Department. Just wondering if you'd come across any examples of where this technology is being used in the NHS, or alternatively, if there are any impediments being put in your place by government or regulators, or anything they could do to help encourage the industry.
The example that springs to mind from the research we did on the Internet of Things is there's a lot of work being done around the frail and elderly. So there's a variety of investigations or experiments being undertaken where they're introducing various forms of tracking technology, which includes spatial technology to monitor people moving around, pressure pads, communication technology, which feeds data from the environment for the frail care environment to individuals who are providing the care. And the principle behind that being that it should involve less resources on site in order to provide a much safer and more secure environment for individuals in the elderly or dementia situations. So those are the ones that spring to mind. I know the NHS is looking at a wide range of possible other uses from uses of basing tracking technology. They're looking at using it on their own population as well. So I know that's underway, but the ones that we actually picked up on the research were those where they were supporting the dementia and frail care environment.
Got one question on the left-hand side here, third row.
So you've done a lot of thinking about new products for technology, but given that the insurance industry writes a lot of guaranteed products that go out 20, 25, 30 years, is there a danger in those products actually somehow suddenly people anti-selecting against them in the future? Did you do any thinking about that?
Not specifically, but yes, I mean, it's going to depend how this evolves and how the different products evolve, and also how people's use of the technology evolves, so that they they have the information they need to be able to anti-select, I guess is the thing. So yeah, some of the long-term guaranteed products that are already in place potentially could be at risk, I guess, if people find they have different information to make that decision.
Any other further comments or questions? Okay, in that case, I'll move on to our second working party this evening, the Antibiotic Resistance Working Party. This working party was established in January 2017 with the aim of developing a simple modelling framework for the impact of antibiotic resistance on mortality. The final model will be released at a sessional paper next year, but tonight we'll get the opportunity for a sneak peek as the working party provides an overview of their motivation and an update on their work to date. This evening we have 3 speakers representing the Antibiotic Resistance Working Party. To my far right, we have Nicola Oliver from Medical Intelligence. Nicola is the founder of Medical Intelligence, which was established in 2007. It's a consultancy dedicated to providing impartial, expert insights into the main drivers behind changing in life expectancy and disease risk for the insurance industry. Prior to that, Nicola worked as a nurse in the National Health Service in intensive care and in public health. Nicola is an affiliate member of the IFOA and is chair of the Diabetes Working Party, as well as being deputy chair of the Antibiotic Resistance Working Party. On Nicola's left, we have Ross Hamilton. Ross qualified as an actuary 2 years ago and has been working in pensions consultancy over the past 7 years. He recently moved over to work in pension risk at Lloyds Bank, looking at asset liability monitoring, investments and assumption setting, including longevity for accounting and funding purposes. Ross volunteered for the Antibiotic Resistance Working Party to help further his understanding of mortality drivers and has been working on the modelling and literature review work streams. And finally, towards the centre of this table, we have Matthew Edwards. Matthew works in the life insurance practice of Willis Towers Watson, leading work around mortality, longevity, and policyholder behaviour. He is particularly interested in the application of advanced analytics to life risk, the interface between actuarial techniques and medical expertise, and innovation, primarily innovation through repurposing. So with that, I'll hand over to Matthew.
Yeah, great. So thanks very much, Chris, and thanks very much, everyone, for not having scarpered in readiness for the match. I'm going to be kicking off halfway through our talk, so maybe when Nicola hands over to Ross, in fact, that'll be an interesting sign. So we've had a very interesting talk, basically looking sort of towards the future in a rather sort of positive, or very positive and optimistic and almost science fiction-y way. And our talk is almost the opposite. It's almost rather looking backwards and picturing how things might work if the whole of medical science in respect of antibiotics go back 50 years. So we've just had lots of optimism and fascinating stuff, and we're going to give you a bit of gloom and doom here, but hopefully not too much for Monday night anyway. So when the drugs don't work, the reason for the title is actually if you're sort of enthused by our gloom and doom, enthused is probably not the right word for the gloom and doom equivalent of being enthused. If you're sufficiently depressed to want to go and find out more, there's a very, very good book called When the Drugs Don't Work by the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Dame Sally Davis, or Dame Professor Sally Davis, something like that. And it's sort of a 100-page penguin introduction to the subject. It's very, very readable. I remember one talk we did at the Life Convention last year. I mentioned this at the beginning, and sort of during the course of the talk, it must have been obviously a bit more boring than I thought. Somebody had sort of downloaded it and started reading it on their Kindle, so you could always do that. But anyway, that's the origin, and it's very good to follow up if you want to do a bit more research without actually going and joining our working party. So what we want to do here is give you a very quick overview as what we're trying to achieve in the working party, which is basically, sort of Chris has said, we're trying to come up with some sort of useful modelling structure. And then in the best practice of chairs of working party, because I'm the chair, I can then sort of delegate all the hard bits as I've done during the course of the last year. So delegating the sort of hard worth giving us the medical overview to Nicola, and then Ross will talk through the model structure and the parameterization, and will then flip back to me for some results. And then put them in inverted commas, simply because at this stage they're very draft. We've only been modelling and parameterizing for one pathogen, which I think one of my colleagues has a sort of an example pathogen on their body somewhere, so we can sort of take a look at that and see where we're going with that and have a sense of the order of magnitude of the results. So that's the basic theme there. So, working party background, almost exactly 2 years ago, in my capacity as a sort of somebody on the Mortality Research Steering Committee, we thought it'd be a good idea to have a session here with a couple of talks and papers and so on antibiotic resistance, because it seemed to be more and more in the news, something which is going to have a potentially material impact on mortality, longevity, and the profession hadn't really been talking about it much. So we had this event and sort of coincided with a longevity bulletin, which was sort of around the theme of antibiotic resistance. And we sort of had a sort of a show of hands at the end as to whether the actors in the room thought it'd be useful. It was, in fact, a fairly packed evening because there was no football on, or cricket or anything else. And there's very much a very positive interest in actually getting together with some sort of working party and developing some form of model that actually would find useful to be able to further the work in this area. And the reason we want to go ahead and develop a model, not leave it to others. So, for instance, the O'Neill review, which came out around about that time 2 to 3 years ago, the O'Neill review painted a bit of a gloom and doom picture. And you sort of went and read the paper, and they sort of talked about various models developed by, I think, RAND and KPMG, been mentioned a bit as developing models in this area. And it's actually very, very hard to sort of penetrate the surface of these and find out what's going on. One of them is very much built around economic drivers, doesn't really seem to sort of delve into what you might expect a mortality model would do, and the other was sort of equally obtuse. So we thought actors would be useful for actors to have a model which would help them to sort of think through what are the impacts going to be of antibiotic resistance. Is it going to be a material? And also, what would you do about stresses for your glorious sort of Solvency II internal models and so on? So that's the reason we sort of decided to go off and start building a model. So we formed the working party, started a year and a half ago, with the aim of developing this sort of interesting and useful modelling framework. So working party members, I'm sort of at the top of the list, and Nicola Oliver has been providing a huge amount of very useful medical input, as you'll hear from her in a moment, and Sheridan, who is not with us at the moment. That sounds a bit sort of somber, doesn't it? He's quite healthy. He's recently had a baby, so he's probably feeling less healthy. Craig Armstrong from Aviva and Ross have all been very, very busy with developing the model structure and parameterising the model. And Craig, we've put a sort of 2017 note to his name because he was so busy with his work at the end of last year, sort of burnt out. And so he's driven the project forward incredibly, but he's no longer active. And various other people important for various other aspects, in particular bits and pieces of literature review and general sort of moral support. So that's the background. That's what we're trying to achieve in this session. So I'll hand over to Nicola for the medical overview. I don't know which way around you're going to come, actually.
Good evening. Thanks for the little intro there, Matthew. And apologies to anyone who heard this about a month ago and probably previously at the Life and Health Conference last year, but we have updated as we've gone, so I promise there'll be something more interesting in it and just a little sprinkle of doom and gloom. Okay. So the first question, I guess, is what actually is antibiotic resistance? And it's the medical understanding that's helped us to really shape some of the parameters and data points that we have put into the model. So antibiotic resistance is pretty much a survival of the fittest scenario. Antibiotic resistance arises quite naturally. It can arise quite spontaneously, but also it is something that's passed on from one generation of bacteria to the next. Simply put, in the presence of an antibiotic, the bacteria that are self-selected to be resistant survive. Those who are not resistant die, and then you have a generation that continues of resistant bacteria or pathogens. It all means the same thing. And bacteria are very well placed to be able to spread the resistance because, for one thing, they have a very large population. The second thing is that their evolution happens at an extremely fast pace. For instance, each generation of bacteria can reproduce sometimes in as little as 20 to 30 minutes, so an extremely fast pace. And they're able to pass on their resistance in two different ways, not just the standard, what we know as vertical gene transmission, where reproduction takes place, the cells split, and you have any resistant criteria are then passed on to the daughter cells. Bacteria also have a very clever way of developing their resistance by spreading it horizontally. They can simply pass DNA material between other bacterial cells. It doesn't require reproduction in order for that to happen. So in the presence of an antibiotic, as I said, the susceptible bacteria are killed, the resistant ones thrive and continue to pass on their information. But we know that we have antibiotics. So what do antibiotics do? They kill the bacteria in two ways. You have a nice, healthy bacterial cell in the middle. It's a very simple structure with a wall containing plasmids, DNA material, etc. inside. So the bactericidals work by interrupting the pathway that the bacterial cell uses to build the wall around it. So simply weakens the cell, and basically the bacterial cell will just split. And there's a large group of antibiotics that fall under that particular umbrella. The most likely one that you'll know are beta-lactams, i.e. penicillin. The second group, known as bacteriostatic, actually work on the inner workings of reproduction of the cell. So in essence, they slow down the rate at which the bacterial cell can reproduce. So it doesn't actually kill it. What that allows you to do with your fantastic immune system, which we mustn't forget that we have, allows the host defense mechanisms to kick in because the bacteria is no longer multiplying quickly. Because of that, bacteria that come from that class of antibiotic require a sufficient duration of time in order to work. And that is where the problems arise regarding not taking antibiotics for a correct period of time. If they come from that class, it's absolutely essential. Some drugs also have a crossover effect. They can have an impact on both sides of that attack. So we got together as a group because, of course, it's become globally accepted that antibiotics are no longer as effective as they used to be against some of the major pathogens. And the question is, why has this happened? The first one really goes back to what I talked about, the evolutionary system that's in place around bacteria, because bacteria, like all species, have a survival of the fittest, and therefore, in the face of some antibiotics, they will thrive. Simply using antibiotics will create resistance. Secondly, they've been overused, and in particular, I'll talk about inappropriate use. Antibiotics are only going to be effective against the bacteria. They simply won't work against the virus. And for most of our general, ordinary, day-to-day infections that we all experience, that our family experience, particularly our children, those are viral infections that are not going to respond to an antibiotic. However, we live in a culture where there's an expectation that if we're sick, then we'll take a pill and then we'll get better. So we're given antibiotics for viral infections, and they obviously are not going to have any effect whatsoever. The other issue that is quite key is around the food chain and becoming more and more of interest. Back in the 1950s in the US, chicken farmers discovered that chickens that had been administered antibiotics grew very quickly, very fat. And it became accepted that you gave antibiotics as a growth promoter into the food chain. And this really resulted as expectation of cheaper, faster food to our tables. The problem is that those antibiotics remain present in those animals, and we're ingesting that. That happens in chicken and beef and pork. Secondly, that antibiotic-resistant bacteria are also present in those animals and will remain active in undercooked meat. Now, we have a lot of legislation in the EU which prevents use now of regular antibiotics in animals and in spraying of some fruit crops. But that doesn't control for any sort of wider populations. Antibiotics are allowed to be given to farm animals in the case of illness. That's accepted, but they're still then a route into the food chain. So we know how antibiotics work against bacteria. We know how bacteria work against antibiotics, and we now know how those things have made it into the human system. So what is the size of the problem? Well, we know that there are a large amount of pathogens now that are causing problems. And what do they actually do? The biggest problem is around the incidence of something called septicemia, which is also called bacteremia, which is also called sepsis or a blood infection. All of these things mean the same thing. You are not going to die from a urinary tract infection, and you're not going to die from a wound infection, but you will die if those bacteria enter your bloodstream. In fact, the case fatality rate of septicemia in severe case is 80%. And this is because if a bacteria enters your bloodstream, your immune system mounts an extremely overblown response and basically attacks your major organs. You go into organ failure and you die. And we are exposed to the risk of antibiotics and failure of antibiotics throughout our whole life. At childbirth, for both women and the children that are born, we don't routinely give antibiotics in childbirth anymore, but there's certainly a peak in use at those times. Meningitis and trauma in childhood, these attract the use of antibiotics. And going forward through the age ranges into older, middle age range, there are also circumstances where antibiotics are given to treat prophylactically. And in particular, certain types of chemotherapy. Certain types of chemotherapy render the immune system extremely vulnerable, and you're open then to potential infection. Also, any type of surgery that involves placing something inside the body and leaving it there. So heart valve replacement, any type of joint replacement. If you think about the number of people that receive a hip replacement each year in this country, it runs into many thousands. We could be faced with a forward scenario where we don't do the surgery because we don't have the antibiotics to cover. So you're left with somebody with a prolonged state of disability. The reason that you need a hip replacement is because you have a diseased joint. Or you take the risk, do the surgery, find that there are no antibiotics to cover an infection that ensues, and it's quite a high rate of infection, and you have an even worse case scenario of an infected joint, which can often take a year or two before any kind of treatment can become to fruition. So the main routes in to a septicemia are through the urinary tract, through the respiratory tract, through the skin, and through the abdomen. So all surgeries are at risk. So not just risk of disability and morbidity, but also increased mortality. As I mentioned before, the case fatality rate for a severe septicemia is around about 80%. So in 2016, the World Health Organization put together a priority list of pathogens which they felt were the greatest threat. And what they wanted to do was to instigate increased research and development of the more appropriate and effective drugs. Because one of the other issues around antibiotic resistance is that there are very, very few new classes of antibiotic. That's another challenge. Whereas we have each year many, many hundreds of new approvals for mainstream chronic diseases such as cancer and heart disease, I don't believe there's been a novel class of antibiotic for probably 10 to 15 years. And this is one of the issues, partly because of the route discovery is fairly more complex, but also it's not particularly economically advantageous to a pharma company. If you produce a blockbusting drug that treats blood pressure, that patient will be taking that drug for the rest of their life. You take an antibiotic for a week, so where's the R&D incentive in that? So they put together this list from a selection of 20 different pathogens, and they wanted to assess it against a number of weighted criteria, which I show there on the left. And they came up with a top 12 list of critical, high, and medium in terms of priority. And these were the ones that gained the highest score, if you like, in the weighting analysis. So what we're going to do now is have a brief look at those top three, not really much of an accolade, in terms of what type of infections they produce, what the risks are, and what the current status is. So these are the three. I'll just call them. So the first one is something called Acetona balmanae. We'll just call it A. balmanae. Pseudomonas, and a whole family of different bugs called Enterobacteriaceae. You don't have to remember how to pronounce them. So we'll start with A. baumannii. Now, one of the chief concerns with this one, and this is why it makes the top of the list, is that it's particularly prevalent in the hospital setting. So you have vulnerable patients who are already exposed to other factors, are also at much higher risk of contracting this bug. And it's a very clever bug. It's able to survive on dry surfaces for very many months. And it is known to be driven by very poor infection control, so not basic washing of hands, and by overuse. And one of the biggest concerns is that A. baumannii has now been discovered to be resistant to a very last case scenario type of antibiotic called colistin. Now, this is an antibiotic that was developed in the 60s and not used very frequently because it causes damage to the kidneys. But in a risk-benefit scenario, often you have to go down that route. So you have an intensive care patient, as you can see in the figure there. And the problem with being in intensive care is that you introduce lots of different ways to get an infection into your patient. So you stick needles in them, you stick tubes in there, into their bladders, you put tubes into their veins, and you put a nice big tube into their lungs. So immediately lots of different routes for infection to crowd in. And A. baumannii is associated with extreme cases of pneumonia, wound infections, urinary tract infections, and ultimately a bloodstream infection, a bacteremia, as we've already mentioned. So the antibiotics that are available to treat this are starting to become a very short list indeed. The next down the list, Pseudomonas. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but it's a very common infection. It's a bacteria that is found very widely in the environment. And it's actually responsible for very mild infections as well as some very serious infections. So it does have a very similar profile to the previous pathogen, very prevalent in hospitals, driven by poor attention to hygiene in terms of basic hand washing, and is very much associated with a very similar set of infections such as pneumonia, wound infections, and then ultimately to a bloodstream infection. So the last group that I'm going to look at is from this group, the Enterobacteriaceae. Now, this is actually a large family of pathogens who all respond in a very similar way and work in a very similar way. And you may have heard of a couple of members of that family, if you like. That Salmonella is one, and E. coli is another. And the reason that we're interested in the E. coli, I'll tell you a bit more in a moment, but this group of pathogens are responsible for quite a lot of nasty type of infections, in particular digestive tract infections. The standard ones we've talked about already, respiratory tract and urinary tract. But in the last sort of 10 years, it has become evident that E. coli is becoming more and more responsible for the numbers of bloodstream infections that we're seeing. So much so that Public Health England started to monitor the rates of E. coli infections, and particularly to monitor the rates at which people were dying from blood-borne based E. coli infections. And the main route in for an E. coli bacteria into your bloodstream to get there eventually is via your urinary tract. So it's a very, very common cause of urinary tract infections which become untreatable. That infection then ascends to the kidneys, then it becomes into the blood, and then that's where you have the bacteremia. And because Public Health England were very interested in these rates of infection and rates of death, it made it easier for us to gather the data in terms of infection rates and mortality rates. And E. coli is the pathogen of choice for our modelling in this exercise. But we will be moving on to look at more pathogens in the very near future, and in particular those ones from that World Health Organization list, the critical list. And why it is important? Well, as Matthew mentioned, Dame Sally Davis spoke at the Spring Lecture last year and has brought this to the fore in the UK in terms of bringing it to the attention of the press, writing extensively about it. And in fact, about a year ago, there was a pilot study run for GP surgeries in England where several letters were sent to GPs in a way to try and encourage them to do less prescribing. This had a reasonable effect, so small measures are being taken. And the O'Neill report estimated very many millions in future deaths if we don't do anything about it at all. As I mentioned before, we have a problem with finding new drugs because of the way that the model is based for pharmaceutical reimbursement, and also changing people's behaviours. Our expectation that when we get to a GP that they're going to give us some pills. But we have many things to be concerned about. A study just published a year or two ago found that between 2000 and 2015, when you would expect to see a reduction, one would hope, in antibiotic use, we've actually seen a 65% increase around the world, which is really incredible considering the messages that are supposed to be going out there. And this has been driven mostly by low and middle income countries as they start to increase their wealth. We see a correlation between increasing GDP and increasing use of antibiotics. There's also been a rise in the ability to buy antibiotics and bypass the whole prescription process. You can do this in some countries as an over-the-counter event, but as we know now, you can probably buy antibiotics from the internet. And in this particular study that I've highlighted here, one of the biggest issues, and this comes from India, is something called a fixed-dose combination, where drugs are made cheaply and they will combine together several types of drugs in one pill. So if you needed something for an infection, but it wasn't the correct antibiotic, you might find in that pill an antibiotic for a different type of infection. Or if you took a prescription for something else entirely, you may find hidden inside there is also some more antibiotics. And more recently in the news, the first case of antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea. This was a gentleman who returned from the Far East, and the usual combination of oral antibiotics did not work, and he required 3 days of intravenous antibiotics. Additional cases are emerging around the world. So even in infections where we've previously found them extremely easy to treat, we're now in a situation where that is less likely the case. But I would like to leave you on just one or two notes of optimism. One of the greatest discoveries really has been understanding the method in which we are able to identify new antibiotics. And that's always been a bit of a challenge, partly because each time scientists start to look for new antibiotics, they just keep finding the same ones. But there's a new discovery platform that's allowed scientists to look in samples of soil. And in particular, they've managed to isolate a class of antibiotic called the malacidins, which we know are particularly effective against what we know as multi-drug resistant pathogens. So that's a bug that can fight off many different classes of drug. Second study here, we're now looking, of course, at genomic data. So that is able to identify which bacteria have a DNA propensity, a genetic propensity to be resistant, and to maybe even start to manipulate that resistance to our own advantage. Which leads me to the last study here. And many of you may have heard of CRISPR. It's a way to be able to edit genetic material simply by snipping out the parts of it that you don't want and inserting healthy parts. Well, this is something that can be done inside a bacterial cell just as effectively. So there's certainly studies that are starting to look at literally manipulating the DNA of a bacterial cell in order for it to turn on itself and destroy itself. So this is one of the ways in which we could tackle antibiotic overuse without having to discover new antibiotics. So that's the medical overview and what informed our decision-making about the type of pathogen and how we were going to model. So I'll just hand over now to Ross to take over the second part.
Right. Okay, thanks very much, Matthew, for the introduction to the working group, and also to Nicola for the medical overview as well. Very interesting stuff. And for the new slides too from last time as well. It's very, very helpful. So just moving on to the model structure and parameterization work streams. Just going to briefly take you through these and what we've done so far. Although, just to note, it is still a work in progress. So this is just a kind of sneak peek at what we've done so far. So where did we start in trying to determine what type of model structure to go with to look at antibiotic resistance? The first step was just to clarify what our objectives are. So here we settled on modelling the effects of both mortality and morbidity due to rising or variable resistance to antibiotics in the future. The next stage, after defining the objectives, we took a look at what literature was out there. And this was to help inform us as to what research has been done, what we can use to inform what we've done, what we're going to do, and then what we can learn as well from what others have produced. And both Nicola and Matthew mentioned the O'Neill review, so that was a great starting point for us because it was a very high-profile review, and there were 2 models produced by KPMG and RAND, which we took a look at and decided that although their approach was really useful as a starting point, we certainly wanted to do something different for our purposes. We then looked at a bit wider field and found some meta-studies which were really, really helpful because they essentially did all the work for us, and they categorised a lot of the research that had been produced in the last 15 years. They categorised that research by what the question was they were trying to answer, and also what model they had produced in trying to answer that question. And that threw up that there were a variety of ways we could look at this, not to mention regression analysis, survival models, significance testing, and just to name but a few. And there wasn't also one approach that any particular question had taken in terms of model structure. So now we had a good base from which we could work on in terms of looking at all the different types of models and what structures have been used, and we just wanted to firm up on how we wanted the structure of our models to look like. So here I've just got a few up there. So it needed to be complex enough to model the scenario that we were trying to illustrate, but not overly complex that, for example, the data burdens were too great or the data didn't exist to actually populate the model. And finally, we wanted to make a model that was adaptable so that users could input either their own data or their own assumptions about future resistance to then form their own view on how they think this is going to impact morbidity and mortality in the future. So taking all that together, the model structure that we decided to go with was a multi-state Markov model. It fit the criteria that we'd set, so it was a relatively simple model. It's well known to the actuarial field. There's good availability of data for the transition rates for the states that we've shown here. And again, it produces the appropriate output. So it kind of ticks all those boxes. So here's an illustration of the model structure on the slide over here. So you've got your typical healthy and dead states, and then in the middle there are 2 sickness states which are a little bit hard to read from the back there. So you have one sickness state where you have an infection that is susceptible to antibiotics, and then the one on the right is you have an infection that is resistant to antibiotics. So, now that we had decided on what type of structure of model to use, we then set up the parameterization workstream to go away and start to fill in the blanks there. So you can see the little sigmas above each of the arrows there, and so that's the transition intensity between each state. And those transition intensities can be informed by data that we can observe and have been collected. And so now I'd just like to take you through some of the data sources that we've taken, some of the issues that we've come up against when looking at that data. Right. So Nicola mentioned earlier that we've taken a look so far at just E. coli. And one of the reasons for this was the availability of the data that's out there. So, for example, Public Health England has started producing some statistics based on the incidence of people getting E. coli since, I think, going back to 2013. So while obviously a limitation to this is that we'd like the data set to come to be a bit wider, this is still a useful starting point. So this Public Health England data showing us the number of reports of E. coli in each year split by various different age groups was very helpful. But we've had to supplement that data in order to get a split between which of those infections are resistant to E. coli, resistant to antibiotics, and which are susceptible to antibiotics. So here we've looked to the ECDC, or more specifically the EARS network, which is the European Antibiotic Resistance Surveillance Network. It's quite a mouthful, so I'll just say EARS from now on. And the EARS network produces rates of resistance to various different pathogens and to what type of antibiotic they're resistant to as well, going back to around 2002 across Europe. That data has some breakdown, so it's split by various different regions. So, for example, we're able to look at the UK specifically. And in addition, there is some information within there that splits it down by various different age groups as well. So we can take this resistant data of the various different years, combine that with the Public Health England data to essentially split those reports into those that are resistant and those that are susceptible in this instance, we've looked at E. coli and its resistance to third-generation cephalosporins, which I think, if you have any questions about, I'll probably direct you towards Nicola, and not try and answer anything about that now. So just going on to a couple of the limitations on this data as well. So I mentioned that monitoring on E. coli is limited. There's also little information out there on how the level of resistance actually interacts with the level of incidence. And you might think intuitively that they would interact in some way, but there just isn't the evidence out there at the moment. And finally, and this is a common theme throughout most of the data that we've collected, is potential bias. So, for example, here, Public Health England is looking at the healthcare-acquired infections. So this could understate the level of infections. They're actually being reported, not including those outside of the healthcare setting. So just moving on to the next level down, so just looking at the mortality rates from E. coli in this instance. So again, Public Health England is producing some information on the case fatality rates of E. coli. And again, that's split by various different age groups, and there's some data going back to, I think, 2013 as well. However, again, similarly, there's no split in the data between that which is resistant and that which is susceptible to antibiotics. So here we've had to supplement this information with some academic research papers that we had found from the literature review. And we've been able to use some of the, the relative ratio of how severe your case fatality rate is with a resistant version of E. coli relative to a susceptible version of E. coli. So again, there's a limitation there just with, is that really a reflection of what's going on in the UK data that we're looking at? But unfortunately, just the data isn't quite out there in the granular detail that we need. And again, there's some bias within this data just in terms of what populations are being sampled here. So we've now been able to take all this information and populate our base scenario for what the different transitions are between the various different states. However, an important element of this model is actually looking at, well, how might resistance impact and trends in resistance impact these different, the movements around the states of the model over time. So as noted earlier, helpfully the EARS network has data going back to 2002 on antibiotic resistance in a UK setting, split down by pathogen and antibiotic that it's resistant to. So we're able to take this data and we can essentially extrapolate out. So for example, here is just a basic straight line method for extrapolating this data into the future. And for our initial parameterization, we've looked at this method just to get a feel for what this might do to mortality and morbidity in the future. But we'd also like the model to be able to look at different trends in resistance. So just a couple of basic examples here. You might have some type of exponential growth in resistance for some reason, or potentially you might have some type of tapered resistance. And the future of resistance will be important here in terms of trying to define the parameters that go into that resistance function in deciding what could define that shape of resistance into the future. So Nicola's mentioned the education pieces that are going on worldwide and how that might impact trends in resistance by reducing consumption through either human consumption or through animal use as well. But at the same time, there are competing factors, noting that new class of antibiotics have not been discovered in a long time. There's not necessarily any new ones in the pipeline at the moment, and the lead time to actually producing these types of drugs can be well over 10 years. So it's quite a long-term game, and we're hoping that the model will be able to capture, just in a basic way, some of these effects in projecting out resistance. So that's all I had to say on the model structure and parameterization work streams. Matthew, do you want to take it away with the results, the most exciting part?
Right, thanks very much. So hopefully you've got a good overview of the medical fun and games going on and the way the model is built up and our initial parameterization of E. coli. So what we want to do in this slide, or just 2 slides left now, is give you the sort of order of magnitude sense for where we've got so far with this one pathogen parameterized along the lines of what Ross was saying. So we're looking at E. coli bacteria. We're looking at the working age population, so 19 to 64, mainly because that's the sort of reasonably convenient way the data are bracketed in terms of age segmentation. And what we're doing here is projecting out 20 years' time. So we've taken one of those of gradually increasing lines that Ross was showing and projected that forward 20 years. And then this leads us to a bit of a problem. And clearly when we sort of release things, we're going to have to sort of may provide various different scenarios. Because if you think about it, there are intuitively sort of 2 fairly likely outcomes, neither of which is going to be just gradually increasing resistance ad infinitum. It's going to be either resistance increases and then cures and found and it's all managed and it goes down again, or it sort of ends up compounding up out of control almost forever and ever. So we've provided almost a mean of those 2 positions. So that mean hopefully gives some sort of sense of what might happen, but it itself is a fairly, you might argue, an unlikely event compared to those 2 slightly more extreme positions. Anyway, that said, what we've got from that is overall a 1% increase in mortality rate in 20 years' time from one strain. So 1% in relative terms, I'll hasten to add, not absolute terms. So that's actually very small, as you'll appreciate, unless you're sort of a reinsurer with massive exposures. So 1% increase in mortality rate from one strain in 20 years. So in terms of mortality rates, it's very, very small. If you look at it in terms of what the impact is on mortality improvements, it's slightly more interesting because obviously the improvements themselves are an order of magnitude less than the mortality rates. If you sort of think it through 4 or 5 pathogens and assume that we sort of bundle them all up and there's a similar impact from them together, and that could give us that impact restated as a proportionate reduction in longevity improvements. It could be in 20 years' time of the order of 0.2-0.25% per annum reduction in longevity improvement rates in 20 years' time. So although it's very small compared to the absolute rates of mortality, it's still just about material in terms of the impact viewed in terms of mortality improvements. And that's where we've got to so far. Again, that's just from very indicative draft modelling. And as I was saying, it's to some extent falling between 2 sort of plausible scenarios at the moment, a sort of disaster scenario of things going terribly badly, or a sort of a nice and cosy scenario where things go badly and then everybody steps in and cures everything. So at the moment we're sort of halfway between those 2. But hopefully it gives you some idea of the orders of magnitude, which are a lot less doomy and gloomy than some of the things you've may have heard in the headlines, or some of which Nicola alluded to in 1 or 2 of her slides. The other interesting thing we can do with this model is look at plausible stresses. So we can sort of, looking at some of the 95% confidence intervals around our work as opposed to 1 in 200, that was giving us increases in overall mortality, again in 20 years' time, of the order of 10 to 20%. So again, it's not very nice, but it's not quite as catastrophic as what you might have expected from some of the headlines. So that's hopefully that's of interest in terms of positioning where we are at the moment. Regarding next steps, we're sort of looking to sort of carry on the model development over the summer. One of the problems we've had with the working party is actually getting people who've got day jobs to volunteer large amounts of time, which is why we sort of initially aimed to finish by the end of last year, and it's still dragging on with just 1. So we're getting a couple of sort of new people in through sort of CAS Business School, MSc people with sort of a summer to spare who want to get involved in all this fun and such like. So we're confident we're going to get a sort of fully developed model with 4 or 5 pathogens. Think also about how there'll be sort of degrees of interaction between the pathogens, validate, document, and all the usual fun stuff. That should lead us to having all that to present at a sessional meeting at the start of next year. So if you like, a proper set of results, more detail on how we've gone about the parameterisation, and also publishing in some way the actual spreadsheet model with parameters so that you can go off and play with it in your homes, if that's where you like to play with ABR models. And this is all going to be based on UK data, so if you're interested in other territories, clearly you can use the same sort of framework and structure for other territories, but we'll be looking just to parameterise for UK. So hopefully that'll be something to look forward to, and hopefully this has given you a good idea of the sort of direction of travel at the moment and an interesting sort of overview of what the main issues are. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, thanks very much to Matthew, Ross and Nicola. So at this point, I'd like to once again open the discussion to the floor. As a reminder, please wait for the microphone to come to you, and please state your name before your question or comment. So in the front row here.
Hello. Thank you. The name's Martin White. This is about stepping back a bit and looking for a wider perspective. Can we put all of this into context with overall worldwide pandemic risk from all causes, including viruses? Are we directing our worrying to all the right areas?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question, because if you're sort of an actuary interested in mortality and longevity, you want to consider all the different drivers from, pandemics on the one side, sort of diabetes epidemics, or not diabetes, chronic deterioration and so on the other side. And the aim of this working party with the ABR is just to look at this particular one aspect in isolation. So I'd agree it'd be nice to be able to looking at a wider scope from the point of view of the overall impact. This particular working party and the objective is very, very much just ABR. So we're not doing everything and not trying to do everything, but hopefully what we are trying to do is going to be useful.
Here in the front.
Thank you. Brian Rizel. A comment and a question, please. It struck me that a 20% increase in mortality in 20 years is actually quite big. But I wanted to ask about, most deaths, almost all deaths in a lifetime come over 65. And you said you were modelling up to 65. Yep. But it seems to me that people are in hospital more, they're more likely to have an operation and so on. Do you see a much more substantial increase in mortality in the over 65s? And will you be building that into your model?
Yeah, do you want to talk about the sort of indirect impacts? So in terms of operations?
Yeah, so you were right in saying about the increased risk in the older groups, and not least because the immune system deteriorates as one ages, so you have to consider that. And I think that in terms of morbidity, we are hoping to examine in a bit more detail the impact on things like not being able to undergo surgery that would otherwise give you a much more comfortable life. Plus, of course, certain types of chemotherapy which may not be able to go ahead. So there are certainly aspects around different age groups that we will be considering. And the other issue, in a sort of more UK-centric type of way, I guess, is also looking at local health resources and whether or not certain surgeries may well not be an option anyway. So, yeah, that is something we're going to look at.
Any other comments or questions for either working party? So on the right-hand side here.
Yeah, it's Robert Hall. I just wondered whether the working party had looked back, maybe, 30 years, to the AIDS working party and how that model developed and then evolved, and its sort of responses as further data came out. Because when one sets up one of these models, it's sort of interesting to see how you can factor in additional data as it comes in and what time series of data is available. Just wondered what the working party's thoughts are in that direction.
It's a very good question. In fact, one of the things that we were sort of discussing quite a lot last year when we were sort of starting to think about the whole working party itself and also the modelling was this aspect of the sort of AIDS, HIV working party work and the models done, well, I guess it was getting on for 20 years or 25 years ago now, and trying to avoid what happened then, which was a sort of, I guess, a sort of sense of panic and sort of extrapolating the curves upwards and upwards and into sort of a space which ended up being completely non-credible. So we've had sort of regard to that in terms of trying to avoid it. We haven't had regard to the one thing you said, which is a very interesting point about how you might go about ensuring a model is best positioned to allow easy incorporation of subsequent years of data once it's been released. So that's quite a useful point, actually. So thank you very much.
In the front here.
Hi, thank you. Darryl Pye. I know we focused on UK data, seems to be a potential global issue for all of us. My question is, to what extent are other countries, other bodies looking at this, and to what extent is the Working Party looking to, work with those to have a global view, especially given how people migrate across the globe?
Two aspects of the question. One is the global aspect, and the other is the modelling and other bodies. So with regard to that second aspect first, the modelling in the other bodies, we've actually had quite a few conversations with Wellcome Trust and other people within the NHS who we thought would be very interested in model development, and clearly they are to some extent interested in us developing a model for them. But the interesting thing about that was that they seem to be doing nothing at all about it themselves, which is, again, sort of quite useful for us to sort of think that our product will be of use outside the actuarial profession, but it's slightly worrying that nobody seemed to be doing any serious modelling themselves. It's pretty useful at this point to have another iteration with them.
We spoke to the Society of Actuaries in the US briefly, and I don't think that they at that time had set up quite an organised approach as we have, but that may have changed because that was around about a year ago. But yeah, we have reached out.
And then the other aspect is the global aspect. So I fully agree. And before the meeting with somebody, we were sort of talking about the analogy with climate change, whereby if you sort of spend 100 billion or whatever it might be, sort of decommissioning or converting all your power plants here, but China and India are still spewing out whatever they're spewing out, it's all a bit pointless. And it's very similar, I think, with the management of ABR, whereas we sort of get all the GPs to sort of tear up all their prescription slips, which will play havoc with their remuneration, I suppose. But then, if the Italians and the French and the carry on prescribing it far too much, and the Indians and the Chinese carry on feeding all their livestock with it, then individual actions here are going to be of pretty much no consequence. So I suppose the UK focus was with the view to ensuring that the product, the model that is as much use as possible to UK actuaries, given that that's who we are and where we are. Probably having a lot of reference to European stats from some of the slides you'll have seen from Ross and the sort of ECDC, and also there's a US equivalent, is that the CDC? Lots of fun 70s pop groups. So the parameterisation will be influenced by the countries, but in terms of the management, clearly we're sort of not responsible for global management, but I was sort of rather pessimistic about how any sort of management framework would work if it's not adopted globally as opposed to just in one country.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, in that case, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask some questions myself. So first to Anna and Colin, who probably thought they were off the hook now. But you may have mentioned once or twice that it's a rapidly evolving field. I guess our insurance industry could be accused of being notoriously slow at times. What's your thoughts in terms of the risk of us being left behind?
I'll pick that up first. Just clarify the question for me in terms of what risk is being left behind.
Yeah, I just think the pace at which our industry moves at times seems to be quite different from the pace that technology companies and this sector in particular moves that. And it strikes me that there's a mismatch there.
Yeah, look, we've been very slow responding up until this point, particularly from the health and care perspective. I don't think we're going to see that continue, not least of all because these types of conversations are starting to happen. A number of insurers within the health and care space have already started to move and started a conversation about what can and should be done. There's an implied threat from the community that has data already and can do things that we can't do because we don't have the data. At the moment, that seems to be a relatively mild threat. It didn't emerge on our analysis as being something that was of inordinate concern, but it's there, and that risk of being left behind could become greater should the interests of the data holders, the data aggregators that Anna referred to, look beyond their current sphere of interest and motivation into something broader like the world of insurance. So there is definitely risks of being left behind in a variety of scenarios. One, by the data aggregators. Two, by competitors within the insurance industry. I think if you are sitting back waiting for the answer to come to you in this space, you will be left behind. There's a risk of being irrelevant fairly quickly. But as Anna also highlighted, there's a risk of diving in and being committed and getting nothing out of that commitment. So I think there are a whole variety of risks around being left behind. And I don't think doing nothing is an option, but also there's care to be taken around what you do and what you do with the information that you collect.
Okay, thank you. And final question for the other working party. I think there were two themes mentioned in terms of the situation we find ourselves in. One was a behavioural one in terms of the overuse of antibiotics, and the other one was at least partly a sort of economic one, that the economics of R&D don't add up. On the second one, I just wonder, as we get into a more dire situation, won't the economics correct themselves?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I understand that there's quite a lot of movement towards completely changing the business model in terms of rewarding pharmaceutical companies for producing new antibiotics. So it would be more of a sort of reward one-off type of reimbursement rather than the current model of pharma, which is sale by volume, simply. So which is something that doesn't really fit with the antibiotic field. So I believe that's certainly something that's being discussed at quite senior levels, government globally and locally. So that will have to change.
Okay, thank you very much. So with that, I'd just like to give some very brief concluding remarks, and they will be brief because we're rapidly running out of time. I think we started this evening with Anna and Colin making me feel quite optimistic about the future with the bewildering range of wearable devices. I guess some concerns in terms of the accuracy of the data they're recording, particularly in a real-world setting. There will be data considerations that we have to think about. Are we capturing the right data? And how can we even cope with that flow of data that we might be expecting? But I think of most interest to me was, as somebody suffering with a prolapse disc at the moment, the idea of smart underwear to help me with my back problem was very appealing. We then came back to earth with a bump, I guess, with the antibiotics working party. So we started off with the medical side, and Nicola talking about the behavioural side, the overuse of antibiotics. And I don't know whether I caught this correctly, but between 2000 and 2015, a 65% increase in the use in global antibiotics. I found that quite shocking. I guess there's some optimism to be had there in terms of, I think I heard potentially some optimism about 2 new compounds and also possibly CRISPR being used to replace antibiotics. And we also had an advert for next year's sessional meeting, which will be in February 2019, where you can see the fully completed model delivered. So with that, I'd just like to thank the authors this evening and everybody who contributed to the discussion.